This week on the agenda, Europe burns. Just why has the number of wildfires risen by more than 50% in just the last 4 years? And what can be done to limit the damage? Wildfires are once again sweeping across Europe, with firefighters battling blazes from Scotland and Spain to France, Germany and Greece. As of the 29th of July, European Commission figures show there have been 1,407 fires in 2026, more than double the long-term average of 632. More than 430,000 hectares of land have burnt, with wildfires in 2026 emitting 17.98 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, more than double the same period in 2025. The World Health Organization says wildfires are becoming more frequent, more intense, and pose a growing threat to people's health. Their figures estimate that the number of wildfires in Europe has risen an extraordinary 57% in the last 4 years. So exactly what is causing this huge rise? And does Europe need to change its entire approach to land use to prevent them continuing to burn out of control? Joining me now are Stefan Doerr, Professor of Wildland Fire Science at Swansea University, and Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment. Welcome to the agenda, gentlemen. Stefan, let me start with you, because as we speak, there are thousands of hectares of fires burning across Europe. Why does it appear that the number of wildfires are rising much faster than other global warming events?
I mean, if you look at the heat waves we've had, they certainly hit us very hard in Europe as well. So the number of fires alone is probably not the best indicator. But what is really extreme this year is that we have several fires occurring in a relatively small area in France and in Spain, affecting large areas of the population. And these fires happening at the same time is especially challenging for fire suppression. So this is really what set this year aside. And of course, the area burnt is increasing in some areas in Europe. France has hit a record now, so it's definitely a serious situation.
I mean, Bob, one scientist has described Europe as ground zero when it comes to the impacts of climate change. Would you go along with that? I mean, why does it seem to be such an issue in Europe compared to other parts of the world?
Well, other parts of the world are experiencing wildfires the same. We remember the great fires that have been taking place on the west coast of the United States and affecting places like Los Angeles. But Europe is the fastest warming continent, and that is why it feels like most of the impacts are happening in Europe. As Stefan said, part of the reason it's so visible is because it's affecting so many people. Europe is a densely populated continent, and so if you start getting wildfires, but remember, we've had large numbers of deaths across Europe already directly from the impacts of heat, and it's a combination of a very dry few months and this exceptional heat that has led to the conditions that are causing these wildfires to spread so quickly.
But Bob, why Europe?
Well, Europe is partly dealing with the impacts of climate change. There's also an effect from cleaner air due to a reduction in air pollution, which means that we're tending to get periods of very stable weather systems where the heat just increases. It sucks the heat up from northern Africa and then sits here, and you have these long periods of exceptional heat.
So, Stefan, do you think then Europe needs a complete rethink of its land management? And what would that even look like?
So land management is often mentioned as a key driver of the fires across Europe, but I think we should remember that at the moment it's the lack of rainfall. Our rivers are record low, so that means any vegetation we have becomes more flammable. So that's one aspect. But yes, we have basically more fuel or vegetation that turns to fuel when it's dry in the landscape, especially in the Mediterranean region due to rural depopulation, but also here in the UK through reduction of grazing in the uplands and other reasons. So in that sense, yes, we definitely need to rethink our land management to make the landscape less flammable. And that doesn't mean we need to cut down all the vegetation or something like that, but basically we need to be much more concerned about keeping some areas free of, or at least a lower level of vegetation, so the firefighters can actually tackle those fires when they are approaching, and at that point actually contain the fire. Putting those fires out completely is essentially impossible. We just need to focus on being able to tackle them better.
Well, Bob, France's President Macron says he wants to replant the pine forests that are burning in the Gironde region. And he wants to do that with different species that are maybe better suited to dry, hot weather, dry, hot climate. Is that going to be enough to solve the problem?
I'm afraid that's not going to work. I mean, it's impossible to have plants that aren't going to be affected by these long periods of dryness. And so we do need to change the kinds of crops we grow for food in Europe, because these periods of dryness have had really devastating impacts on some of the crop yields. But in general, with these long periods of dryness and heat, you know, vegetation just dries out and becomes flammable, and there's not really a lot you can do about it, apart from, as Stefan said, make sure that you have proper breaks in dense vegetation, particularly where they are adjacent to places that people are living. Because most of what we have to avoid, if we can, is the number of people who are being killed by these wildfires. So that means making sure that we're able to stop the fire from hitting homes. We know that wildfires can move very, very quickly. You can't outrun a wildfire often. And so we have to make sure that people are just not in the wrong place at the wrong time.
But Stefan, doesn't it make you start thinking about maybe different kinds of vegetation? Because it seems that the indigenous vegetation isn't suited to what's an increasingly hotter climate. It seems like it's not keeping up with how the land is heating up and how the environment is heating up. And
I mean, that is true. So we can't necessarily go back to the vegetation we would have had before Europe was cultivated, you know, around 5,000 years ago. So, but what is certainly the case is that some species, such as pine trees that are native to the Mediterranean, if you have large areas that cover the terrain, they are very, very flammable. There are other native species, like oaks, for example, that are far less flammable. Yes, they can burn, but in the right place, they would certainly propagate the fire much, much less so than the pine trees we have over vast areas, partly due to planting, but also partly due to natural revegetation in areas that are not managed anymore.
And Stefan, what role do you think technology might be able to play in managing these wildfires?
Yeah, there are many things we need to do, really. And I just come back to Bob's point about the population being exposed to fires. If you look at the global data in terms of death and fire disasters, they're actually relatively low compared to other natural disasters. However, it was steady over the last few decades. There was no change. Roughly speaking, around 60 people or so per year, perhaps 100 got killed in wildfires. In this decade, it's gone through the roof. We have many hundreds of people killed already. At the same time, we have better communication than we ever had. So really, there's something not quite right in how we actually inform the public about escaping fires, what to do during fires, being warned early enough. Now, they're good technologies to do this, but they're not implemented sufficiently. And this is often the case if you have major death events in wildfires, that communication wasn't good enough. But that's only one specific area where technology can really help keeping the population informed and making sure that fewer people are exposed when a fire actually arrives.
But where do you see technology and, I suppose, more nature-based solutions being able to work more hand in hand, more in tandem to tackle things like wildfires?
Well, we know that, for instance, in parts of Britain where they've reintroduced beavers as part of rewilding, beavers tend to create more wetlands and make the landscape less prone to drying out. So more nature-based solutions will actually help us deal with the increasing risk. And they need to be used alongside technological innovations. But there is a basic issue here, which is about if you build houses and buildings and roads next to large vegetated areas, they are going to be exposed to this risk, because these impacts of climate change driven by longer periods of dryness and greater heatness are going to increase for at least the next 2 decades. until the world gets to net zero emissions of greenhouse gases. And so over the next 2 decades, we're going to have to get better at dealing with these kinds of impacts because they are going to get worse.
So, Bob, do we need to be less demanding about where we choose to live, where we decide to lay down our roots?
There is a similar conversation going on in California at the moment. If people feel they want to be able to build in the middle of forests, then they're going to have to face the consequences of that, makes them more vulnerable. I think we have to have a sensible conversation about a clearer separation between areas where people live and natural habitat. That will be better for nature, and it will also reduce the exposure to the impacts of wildfire.
Stefan, what do you think that conversation might sound like?
No, absolutely. I think this is a key point, and that conversation has been going on in the United States in particular for a long time. An additional fact that we have in Europe is basically that rural depopulation, which I mentioned earlier. So areas of France and Spain, for example, also in Italy, there were areas where houses were built at a time when there was no flammable vegetation around, and now it's encroaching because there's still some people living in villages where most people have left, and there's no way they have the capacity to keep the vegetation from encroaching those villages. So this is another aspect where we have to really deal with an increasingly flammable landscape, and not just because of the vegetation, but also because, of course, because of climate change.
And Stefan, considering this increasingly flammable landscape, are there lessons that Europe can learn from maybe some of the hotter global south countries that don't seem to be burning at such a rate?
Well, it's interesting to compare it with global south countries, because many countries, for example, South Africa, if you look at Australia, for example, they've been living with fire for a long time. And if you talk about the rates at which they're burning, they are not lower. They're actually higher in many places in the south. But what is the difference is, if we just use, for example, the state of Victoria, for example, which is similar if you compare that to France. Basically there is essentially that expectation that every so often under extreme weather, fires will get out of control. They cannot be suppressed effectively, and you basically need to evacuate, and you also need to wait for the weather conditions to change for the fires to be able to be tackled. And this is essentially what has happened near Bordeaux as well. The fire got completely out of control, and the French firefighters are fantastic. They have very, very good resources. They know fires very well, but simply under those conditions, you cannot put a fire out, and you can't even stop it properly. You have to basically wait for the conditions to change, and the population needs to be on board with this. They need to understand this. And again, this is something where I think culturally Europe isn't ready to accept the fact that fires are normal.
It's interesting you talk about Europe not being culturally aware or adaptive, but I wonder, Bob, if you think that this latest spate is making governments sort of sit up and take notice, take more notice, and more importantly, take action.
Well, I think it's making them aware of the increased risk of wildfires and the measures that need to be taken to try and reduce the risk. But as Stefan's mentioned, you can't stop the fires happening and you can't stop them spreading. You just can react in a more efficient and timely way to move people out of the way. But what really needs to happen in Europe is a recognition that these impacts are the result of climate change and are going to get worse until the world gets to net zero emissions. Some countries in Europe are weakening their commitment to net zero, and that's absolutely going to create even more damage and losses in Europe. So they have to understand, we reduce our emissions to net zero, we stop these impacts getting worse. If we let them keep going, things just carry on getting worse for longer.
And Stefan, what do you think? Do you think that this is a situation that is inevitably only going to get worse? How close are we in Europe to the limits of adaptation?
Well, the situation is clearly getting worse. There's no question about it. Globally, we know that the length of the fire weather season, so basically the time in which fires can occur, is lengthening everywhere around the world, except some very, very small pockets. And the severity of the fire weather season is also increasing. So there's no question about this. And we are locked into this as well. It will continue to get worse in the future, and it'll get much worse if we continue emitting carbon dioxide. I mean, there's no question about this. So we need to get to net zero. Absolutely, it's a high priority. But at the same time, things will still get worse. So we do need to adapt. And I think we're not at the limit of adaptation when it comes to fire. There's a lot we can do, and we can learn certainly from other countries that have lived with fire much longer than we have in Europe.
Well, we've been number crunching, talking about numbers out of the European Union, European Commission, the World Health Organization. You know, the number of wildfires in Europe has risen more than 57% in just the last 4 years. Is there any real hope we can get that over control over the next 4 years, Bob?
Well, I'm afraid that the conditions are just going to become more conducive to fire. Our ability to tackle them, I mean, you can increase the amount of resource available to firefighters, but some of these fires, just once they get going, they will just continue to move, and we just have to make sure we limit the amount of people who are in the way. So we're just going to have to learn to deal with these and make have the understanding amongst everybody that once a wildfire starts, you should not accidentally start a wildfire by doing something stupid like taking a barbecue out into a wooded area and letting sparks start it. That's the kind of thing we have to stop. But once a wildfire starts, you've got to move very quickly and get out of the way. There's no negotiating with a wildfire. It can sweep you up. You can't even drive away. And we've seen examples, for instance, of people dying in cars because they have not been able to drive away quickly from a wildfire.
A lot of what we've been talking about is how Europe reacts to these wildfires. I mean, Stefan, if there was one thing that governments could do tomorrow, what would it be?
Tomorrow. Okay, just one thing. I think better education to avoid ignitions in the first place and start at schools. Every school kid should be aware of that, and much better preparedness for fires when they occur, including tourists can expect fires to occur in the Mediterranean. That's just a fact. This happens every year. It may hit you, it might not, but it's part of what's happening.
Stefan Doerr, Bob Ward, thank you both very much. Welcome back to The Agenda. The wildfires still sweeping Europe have exposed both practical and political problems in the countries affected. So what lessons should be learned, and what steps do local, national and international organisations need to take now to prevent future devastating fires? With me now is former Spanish MP and Spain's former ambassador to India, Gustavo de Arístegui. When emergencies like these latest wildfires happen, there's a need for local, national and even international governmental organisations to get involved. But that's not always easy, is it?
No, it's not always easy, and we have to bear in mind that Spain has a federal system of government. It is much easier for centralized governments in Europe to fight fires. The coordination is much smoother. And there is, of course, the rivalries between the central government of Spain, which is a very left-leaning government, a coalition of socialists and communists, and the regional governments, which are in a majority center-right. It has been an issue because the Minister of Presidency, who is in charge of the coordination of these things, and the Minister of the Interior, but especially the delegate of the government in Madrid, was very reluctant to declare the national emergency, saying that the president of the region of Madrid needed to very clearly justify that they were overwhelmed by the wildfires. In any case, there are some things and lessons to be drawn from this. The regional system of Spain has done great services to the governance of the country and to taking the government to as close as possible to the citizen. But unfortunately, there are some other problems that haven't been properly addressed, and that one is, for example, emergencies that affect more than one region of Spain. And the worst fire that we had was actually burning 3 different provinces of 3 different regions. And it was a huge problem to coordinate the whole thing.
So communication is an issue, making sure that the equipment is serviced and ready to go is an issue. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez has declared this a climate emergency, which he said would necessitate a state pact to attack the root of the problem in a structural way. What do you think he meant by that?
You know, what we say in Spain is that fires are fought in winter and put out in summer. But if we don't do our homework in winter, cleaning the countryside, cleaning and the security passages and the fire cutting highways, it's going to be impossible to be effective in next season. Look at the result right now. I mean, it is 80% more in the last 5 years than in the previous 5 years. And this is because the legislation does not allow, for example, to clean up the countryside, to take cattle, that is, to graze on common grounds, which would reduce the fuel for the fire. Let us not forget that the more it rains in winter, the greater the risk of fires in summer. And the only way to stop this is to allow people to clean their own properties. I have seen people complaining that I asked for permission at the regional government and the national government. What can I do in my forest? How can I clean up all the dry scrubs, which are the most dangerous fuel for wildfires? This is much more urgent than any kind of climate pact or whatever. Of course, there is a climate change. It is obvious. Temperatures are rising sharply in the last century, and especially in the last 50 years.
So we've talked about Spain, but let's broaden this out a bit. You know, where do the mechanisms of the EU fit in right here? Because it holds a reserve of firefighting planes and helicopters and capabilities for when national and pooled resources run short. I mean, do we need more top-down decision-making when it comes to climate emergencies?
Well, climate emergency and fighting wildfires, I mean, there are two different things, although they converge in the same problem. So when you, let me answer the first part of your question. When you were saying, how does the EU fit in here? How do we share means and ways to fight the fires? There is no such thing. We do not have common means to fight fires in the European Union. It depends very much on the bilateral solidarity of between nations. When Greece was struck by the horrendous fires some years back, it was very much up to the solidarity of Spain, of France, of Italy to send their firefighters and their aircraft over there. And then there's one thing that I'd like to stress very strongly upon. You see, the European Union has not developed an indigenous technology to fight fires from aircraft. And there is one Spanish company that has developed a tank that is on roll-on, roll-off for the A400M Airbus military aircraft, which is a huge aircraft. It is capable of carrying 20,000 liters of retardant. And this is a Spanish invention, but we are still in the game of let's see how we authorize Airbus and the Spanish Air Force to use this tank. We're still in that process. The French have used our invention and used it in these fires, and it has been hugely successful. And then there's two things. The French are developing new aircraft that has twice the capacity of the Canadairs, from 8,000 to 16,000 liters. And then we should be buying the ATR, which is also a European aircraft, French and Italian model, the transformed planes that are capable of launching 12 to 14,000 liters of water or retardant over wildfires. This is what we need to do. Crying over spilled milk is exactly the wrong way to approach this.
Given all of those things that you're talking about, how concerned are you about what critics have called the watering down of the EU's net zero targets with proposed changes to its emissions trading system?
Well, it's all very laudable, but really, I mean, don't you think that it is more urgent to buy firefighting planes? Don't you think that it is more urgent to train firefighters in the sixth generation fires that nobody knows how to fight today? Don't you think that it is probably better if we bought helicopters for complicated valleys and gorges where fires just run through, rushing into the plains, and nobody can actually put those off because aircraft fly too high and too fast? I mean, this is what we need to focus on. We need to change legislation. We need to let cattle back on the fields. We need to let owners take care of their own fields. This is what we need to do. This is much more urgent. I completely agree that net zero is a fantastic objective for the future, but there is no direct relation today in these fires today with that kind of problem. It is a long-term problem, and we are facing short-term tragedies. Let's face the short-term tragedies without forgetting the other thing. But we cannot make one dependent of the other. That is a huge mistake, and that is what we're paying very, very, very dearly.
Gustavo de Arístegui, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out The Agenda Show on TikTok.
Coming up on a future agenda, China Shock 2.0. How's the rest of the world reacting to China's technological advances? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.